Ready to roll? Okay. Let's go again. We'll do the first session this morning on Coriolanus and then shift to Julius Caesar midway through. I'll try to reserve some time at the end of the Coriolanus session for open questions, any questions you may have about the play or what you're beginning to learn about Shakespeare. I did read the three people who sent in papers last night, and I can see you're getting into the swing of things, and I'm happy to see that. So, where are we? I've been trying to show you what it means to talk about politics in Shakespeare. That is, it's not a question of Shakespeare's politics, whether he voted Elizabethan or Jacobean, something like that. And so that, for example, it's not that he takes the side of the patricians or the plebeians. A lot of the discussions of the play try to answer that question, and I think Shakespeare is Shakespeare because he doesn't take sides. It's what makes him such a great dramatist, that he can see always both sides of an issue and therefore dramatizes a genuine conflict in which there's some kind of right on both sides and some kind of wrong. If you're interested, the Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht rewrote Coriolanus, keeping most of it, but it's very interesting to see how much he had to omit in order to make it a Marxist pro-plebeian play. For example, he omits the scene when Sicinius and Brutus get their comeuppance from the people after Coriolanus is marching on Rome. He felt that was a little embarrassing to the socialist cause. So Shakespeare's play is so much more balanced by comparison with what Brecht did with it. But what I've been trying to show is that when we talk about politics in Shakespeare, we're talking about politics as an essential component of human life and therefore essential to his understanding and portrayal of it. The way I could put it is that for Shakespeare, not every human possibility is universally available, and that certain aspects of human nature are developed differently in different regimes, and therefore, for a comprehensive understanding of humanity, you would have to explore a variety of regimes. To me, that's what's most interesting about Shakespeare. It's not unique to him, but close, and that is that he considers such a wide variety of regimes in his work. You know, we're looking at his Roman plays, which, as I'm trying to show, are genuinely about the Roman regime and show how it changed over time. He wrote a series of English history plays that examine the British monarchy, changing and evolving over time. He wrote about Venice in two plays, Merchant of Venice and Othello, and examined what was a very new possibility emerging in his day, a commercial republic, very different from the kind of aristocratic military republic he studied in Rome, and so on. One could spend a lifetime considering the varieties of regimes in Shakespeare. And his plays are therefore a good illustration of the idea of the regime that you saw in Plato and Aristotle. That is, the idea that the political constitution, the shaping of the institutions of the people, help shape their character and, in effect, create them. It's a very common position to speak of the universality of Shakespeare. And he certainly is of universal interest. But I think that view goes wrong when it suggests that Shakespeare was dealing with a kind of universal condition of humanity, because I'd say he would deny that there is such a thing as a universal condition of humanity, that it is a universal aspect of the human condition that we all live under particular political circumstances. And that allows us to develop certain aspects of life and suppresses others. I've quoted this line: Shakespeare's Romans were Elizabethans in disguise. That was said by the great German thinker Goethe. It's also said by Samuel Johnson in his famous preface to his edition of Shakespeare. And that's where he argues that Shakespeare shows us the universal aspects of the human condition, and that's when he says that his Romans are really just Elizabethan Englishmen. And it's, I've been trying to show you that's just not true, that on as important as an issue as suicide, his Romans very much differ from Elizabethan Englishmen. And indeed, I think that was Shakespeare's insight, that he couldn't study anything called the universal human condition, because there is no such thing. We all live in very particular circumstances, and what's most distinctive and important about those circumstances are the political circumstances. So Shakespeare, in order to understand the full range of humanity, had to look at a whole range of different regimes, so that the Roman Republic is a chance to see political human beings at their most political. That if you want to see that option, what it is to be fully absorbed in the polis, in the political, you look at the Roman Republic and its great political achievements, amongst which were conquering the world. And that's what we saw yesterday about this Roman Republic. Everything about it focuses people's lives on the political. It is a political regime that offers real access to politics. Among the patricians, they're senators and get to deliberate on the affairs of Rome, and they have this consulship. And you could reasonably expect to become consul, 2 every year, and they change every year. So it's not an impossible dream. Even compared to the United States, 1 president every 4 years. You got 2 consuls every year. It's not that every patrician became consul, but it's a reasonable expectation, have a good political career, and there was actually a whole hierarchy of offices building up to the consulship, and become a good military figure and maybe win a big victory for Rome, you'll become consul. The Roman Republic satisfied the ambition of its most ambitious men, the patricians, but it even had outlets for the ambitious among the plebeians. They could hope to be tribune. Again, probably only 2 tribunes at a time at this period, but Shakespeare has it at 5, and for much of the history of the Republic, there were 5 tribunes, and eventually I think even 10 tribunes. So Rome offers paths to people who want to be active in politics, and even the plebeians who are not particularly political and seem to be mainly concerned about their bellies, even they have some sense of participation in this regime. They do get to pass on the nominees for consuls, and that's not insignificant, and we see they take it seriously, and they get upset when they feel they've been had by Coriolanus and imposed upon. So you really see it's a regime that engages people in politics and which doesn't offer much in the way of alternatives. The religion is itself political. It's the religion of the polis. It's a Roman religion. It has gods of the city. There's no idea of immortality in the Christian sense of some realm after death that you might aspire to and, for example, might compensate for your miseries here. It is remarkable how much the Roman Republic focuses energies on the here and now and on the political, If you want to be immortal, it will come through achieving great deeds and being remembered in Rome. And so it's no accident that a city with this constitution would produce a military that went on to defeat everybody else in the Mediterranean world. Remembering that passage I read you from Machiavelli, contrasting the pagan religions with the Christian, and thinking about what we will see more as we go through Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra. I mean, this world focuses people's attention on politics and the military, but never forget that that means it excludes a lot. For example, I'm not saying here that Shakespeare thought we should all live in a Roman Republic. I think he thought we could get some lessons from the Roman Republic. My own view is that his history plays are an attempt to show how the English monarchy might be rethought a bit on the model of a mixed regime that would incorporate aristocratic and popular elements. I think that's what Henry V is about, for example. But I'm not saying by this that Shakespeare's claims that the Roman Republic is human or even political perfection. It shows you one option. It's a kind of Kantian hypothetical imperative. If you want life focused on the political, if you want the military to be the be-all and the end-all of human life, you need something like this Roman arrangement. That doesn't mean that you have to have it, and you better recognize what you sacrifice. And you see that, for example, in the love between Virgilia and Coriolanus. It's love, it's not love. For love, we're going to have to wait for Antony and Cleopatra and the imperial regime. And there are whole dimensions of life that are left out of this republic, and whole dimensions of Shakespeare's art and his poetry. Again, those lyrical flights of love that we're so used to in Romeo and Juliet, or many of the comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream, or as we will see in Antony and Cleopatra, that's just not there. And it's not there because Rome actively discourages it in the process of encouraging the political. So this is what I mean by saying that, Republican Romanness is one human possibility, and Shakespeare can only explore it by portraying the Roman Republic. But there's lots of other possibilities, and we'll see them develop. Any questions about that? Okay, then let's continue with Coriolanus and his story. After the tribunes organized the plebeians against him and he's refused for the consulship, Rome banishes him in a marvelous gesture. He says, I banish Rome. And he, as I was talking about yesterday, it's really interesting. He says, there is a world elsewhere, and he marches off to Antium. Now, again, in line with what I was just saying, he doesn't say, you know what, I'm going to become a painter. This political thing didn't seem to lead anywhere. Why don't I become a painter? Or says something, I always wanted to be a stockbroker. Why don't I become a stockbroker, make a lot of money? It's really interesting. The only thing you can think of is, well, let's go to another city. Let's lead another army. And it's perhaps no accident that things don't work out so well for him there. But in a way, that line encapsulates his tragedy. He says there is a world elsewhere, but actually he's so bred a Roman that he can't really imagine a different world. So he goes to Antium, and one of the questions I pose for you is, why does he succeed there when he didn't succeed in Rome? He becomes the leader there in a way that he didn't seem capable of doing in Rome. Anyone got any thoughts on that? Yes.
Well, the citizens there seem less concerned with being exploited economically by their betters, but they really just want to defeat Rome, who has bested them time and time again in battle. So they don't really care if he's not exactly politically correct or whatever term they would use back then. They just understand that he's a capable general who's beaten them, so they might as well use him to defeat his former armies.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. In some ways, they appreciate him more because they've been defeated by him so many times. Anything else? Why doesn't his pride get engaged? Why doesn't he treat the Volskis with contempt? It's a subtle point. Yeah.
Remember did sit on our lunch.
Yeah, he too. I mean, again, you see here he's focused. There's the interesting dialogue at the end of, what is it, Act 4, Scene 6, where, what is it? Act 4, Scene 5, among the Volskis, where you see that war actually focuses the attention. These serving men, this is on page 112, when they hear that they've now got Coriolanus as a general, they're excited. Why, then we shall have a stirring world again. This peace is nothing but to rust iron, increase tailors, and breed ballad makers. It's interesting that the contempt for poetry there, something we see again and again in this Roman world. But the sense here is that peace is the enemy of this world. It leads people to rest on their laurels, that rusts iron, increases tailors. And so this first serving man says, let me have war, say I. It exceeds peace as far as day does night. It's sprightly walking, audible, and full of vent. Peace is a very apoplexy, and so on. The very bottom of the page, talking about peace. And it makes men hate one another, reason because they then less need one another. The war is for my money. War brings out a sense of the common good. By the way, this is very ominous for the future of Rome. Remember the famous phrase, Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It means if Rome ever achieves peace, it's going to have problems here. Here's one idea I've had about this, that the interesting thing is that Coriolanus's Roman prejudices against the plebeians are not engaged among the Volskis. In some ways, I think he succeeds among the Volskis because he is so much an outsider there. Rome has such a history for him. In Rome, he knows who the plebeians are, and he's grown up despising them, and he has a hard time dealing with them. He really, in some ways, among the Volskis, he's able to live out his dream, which is just to stand above ordinary humanity. He has a kind of status of a god among them. And he indeed is compared to a god throughout these later scenes. What else, though, is he compared to? Remember in the he's called a lonely dragon. Remember that? It's one of the things that has people so afraid of him. Well, what do you make of that? That he's either a god or a dragon? In these, yes.
Well, I thought it was interesting when he first arrives, I guess, in kind of tattered clothing to Aufidius's home. The serving men are they're very forward with him, and I mean they even get to the point of threatening him.
Yeah.
Until they find out that he's Coriolanus,
Yeah.
and then they talk about they all kind of they seem to kind of make it up that they were like, oh well, I knew there was something different about him. I knew he was like a great man when I saw him.
Yeah.
But which isn't really consistent with their having threatened him. So I was just wondering, what do you make of that? Because that, we've talked about how, I mean, he's like basically a giant, just a huge guy, kind of WWE type. But it seems that they don't really see that until they know he's great.
Yeah, it's interesting because they see his clothing when he shows up, and he's not dressed up like a noble. Presumably, he's in a kind of disguise. And I think it is a clothes makes the man situation. That is, they're taken in by externals, and they don't know who he is. Again, this is one of Shakespeare's great sympathy for common people, but does question their judgment. And so this is a scene where you see something about common people, that they go by externals. And then, once they know he's Coriolanus, they're impressed. But there does seem to be moments when they feel his strength. Look at top of page 110. What an arm he has. He turned me about with his fingers and his thumb as one would set up a top. There was a very good production of Coriolanus in D.C. 2 months ago. I thought they blew this scene, though, because you ought to have a moment in the scene when Coriolanus exerts his physical superiority. You actually should see that moment. So it's there. The physical presence is there. But, what you see here is something that's very true about ordinary human beings. They're very much governed by appearances and what they think is going on. And so, but I actually do think one could stage that scene to remind us of the physical presence of this man. You had a comment?
Yes, well, to go back to the comment about the lonely dragon, I think that that emphasizes both that Coriolanus has no concrete loyalties to any particular people, and also that's the lonely part, and then the dragon part refers to how dangerous that makes him.
Yeah.
Because he has this great military talent, and he's very aggressive, but without any loyalty to really tie him down, he can do great damage, and that's why the Romans are so afraid of him.
Yeah. Let me just show you a couple of these references. One is on page 121, where Ophidius says, this is line 23, he fights dragon-like, and then page 139, about line 13, this Marcius has grown from man to dragon. I think it's, now that I think about it, I think it's Coriolanus who refers to himself as a lonely dragon when he leaves. Yeah, it's page 96. So line 30, though I go alone like to a lonely dragon. So there's 3 references to him as a dragon, which I think is important. What that called to mind to me, the imagery, was a famous line from Aristotle's Politics. A man without a city is either a god or a beast. Did you guys study that in book 1 of the Politics? What did Aristotle mean by that? Yeah.
If you can be sufficient without a city, it means that you either have to be so powerful that you don't need a city, that it's irrelevant to you, so that you're like a god. Obviously, a god doesn't need a city. Or you can be, like an animal that you're happy in the forest. You don't really need the goods of the city.
Yeah. Yeah, that is in other words, the statement by Aristotle points directly to the idea of self-sufficiency. And I think Shakespeare picks up on this, that we were talking about this last time, that Coriolanus fundamentally wants to be self-sufficient. And you see it in his own self-understanding. I'm either a lonely dragon or a god, and people pick up on that. And that means very dangerous. Gods and beasts are both dangerous because they're not civilized, they're not politicized, they're not part of the polis. In a way, Aristotle's whole definition of the city is of the unit of human self-sufficiency. That is, the pre-political condition, living in families and clans, that's when everybody has to do everything for themselves. The city is that basically, Aristotle doesn't quite put it this way, but he's basically saying that the city is the product of the division of labor. The city is the world in which you have shoemakers to make shoes, carpenters to build houses. You have everybody you need to have a division of labor and be able to fulfill all these human needs. And that's when we're self-sufficient. And someone who doesn't need the city has to be self-sufficient like a god that is above these ordinary human necessities, or just be incapable of participating in the city. So that Aristotle has this, he defines the human condition as needing the city. That's why this famous phrase, man is a political animal, which means to Aristotle, man is an animal who by nature lives in cities. And again, if you found a being that didn't need to live in a city, that being would either be beyond human development or incapable of human development. And you see here what an incredible challenge Coriolanus sets to himself, that he could live without the city. Turns out, of course, he just goes to another city. Because he himself seems to understand that he needs the city to fulfill himself. That's the interesting, in some ways Aristotle defines the city as the unit of human self-fulfillment. And there's, again, Aristotle says the city comes into existence for mere life, but it exists for the sake of the good life. By that he means, we need this body of human beings that can produce all the things we need just to live. But once we have that, then we can do the good things. The way I like to put it is, nobody founds a city to have a theater. Nobody ever thinks, gee, we don't have a theater, we better get together and found a city. No, you found a city because you need carpentry, you need shoemaking, you need bread baking, and so that's what you think of in terms of putting together a city. But once you've done that, once you have your shoes and you have your house and you have your bread, a couple of people can sit around and do nothing, namely be actors. There's enough bread and shoes and houses to go around, so people can say, as they do in 1930s movies, let's put on a show. And then suddenly you have this thing which is very human. Animals in some ways, get their food and shelter. They don't put on plays, but humans do, and then the city permits that. What makes us human, distinctively human, is these things the city can do once it's satisfied the basic human needs. But it really raises the issue about we're strange beings, human beings. In some ways, we look like separate wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S. We each one of us has a boundary, and yet somehow we are unfulfilled when we're alone. Aristotle uses an image like an isolated human being would be like an isolated chess piece. If you just saw a pawn or a rook, what does it mean? It means nothing when it's alone. It only means something on a chessboard with all the other pieces. And that's what we're like as human beings. We don't fulfill ourselves when we're just isolated. And, Coriolanus, I think this is an issue in many of Shakespeare's plays, but Coriolanus is the one that formulates it the most explicitly, this issue of human self-sufficiency. Because on the one hand, we have a character who would like to stand as if a man were author of himself and knew no other kin, and yet it's precisely what he can't do when given the option. When he says there's a world elsewhere, just goes to another city. Now, we haven't talked about Aufidius. What's his role in the play, and how is it related to Coriolanus's seeming success in among the Volsces? How is Aufidius like Coriolanus? How does he differ from him? Yeah.
He's like Coriolanus in the sense that he's a winner. He has a martial spirit of sorts, but he's unlike Coriolanus because he's willing to give up that spot. He's more into the end rather than the means. Coriolanus, his end is, I guess they have different ends. Coriolanus wants to become immortal, whereas, counterpart there just wants to have a thriving polity.
I don't think he'd mind being immortal either, but yeah.
There's mutual respect between the two. They both kind of say in the beginning that if they could just fight one person for the rest of the time, it would be each other. So I think they both appreciate the strength and the valor of each other. But I think Aufidius makes the mistake of just quickly befriending Coriolanus, because he realizes by the end of it that he has won the love of the people so easily, and he's kind of been outshined by Coriolanus. So if they win in Rome, Coriolanus will have both the Volscis and the Romans, and I think he talks about being in his shadow. So that leaves Aufidius to kind of realize that he has to either take out Coriolanus or just kind of be left on the sideline.
Yeah. So what's his problem? Aufidius' problem?
He needs Coriolanus.
What?
He needs Coriolanus.
Yeah, well, he's stuck in a situation where he happens to be living at the time of this great warrior, who's greater than he is. I often feel this way about the other Elizabethan playwrights, some of whom were very good, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, so on. But these poor guys were living at the time of Shakespeare, and they were smart enough to know it. At least Ben Jonson was, and the unfortunate position of living at the same time as the greatest playwright ever. And so Aufidius, in many ways, is a noble warrior. He is Coriolanus' mirror image, his counterpart. We talked about their bromance. They, in some ways, they feel more in common with each other than they do with their own common people, either the Volscis or the Romans. But Aufidius always loses to Coriolanus, and that becomes very frustrating to him. But yes?
Well, I think the relationship between the two is one of the most authentic, maybe, in the entire book. They love to hate each other, and then they love to love each other. And it's very interesting to me that when Coriolanus decides not to go back and attack Rome, Aufidius feels really betrayed. And he says in 5.6 that it was for a few drops of a woman's room which were cheap as lies. He sold blood and labor of our great action. So he has this vision for what they can do together, and they both have this very similar vision of what it means to be great and to accomplish these martial victories. And he doesn't understand why Coriolanus would turn his back on this vision that they both have.
And indeed has every reason to think Coriolanus won't do it. Coriolanus has come to him saying, I hate Rome. I'm now willing to fight against Rome. It is a betrayal of what he said to Aufidius. What's another way, though, in which Aufidius differs from Coriolanus? Yeah.
Well, Aufidius is a little bit more clever than Coriolanus.
Oh.
That he's willing to act through perception, he's willing to think outside the civil battle and to come up with other ways to deal with his problems.
Yeah, and in fact, he's Machiavellian. We'd say if you. This is his speech at the end of. Where is it? It's the end of Act 4, and we talked about this a bit yesterday when someone said that Coriolanus's problem is something Machiavelli points to, that he doesn't have the right virtue for the right time. And this is page 122. Aufidius virtually says that of Coriolanus. This is line 49, so our virtues lie in the interpretation of the time, and power unto itself most commendable hath not a tomb, so evident as a chair to extol what is done. One fire drives out, one fire, one nail. Rights by rights founder, strengths by strength who fail. Come, let's away when Caius Rome is thine, thou art poorest of all, then surely art thou mine. He has this sense that Yeah, in fact, come to think of it, yeah, he says, where's the, oh yeah, it's just before that line 40. Whether defective judgment to fail in the disposing of those chances which he was Lord of, or whether nature not to be other than one thing, not moving from the cast to the cushion, but commanding peace, even with the same austerity and garb as he controlled the war. That's the very Machiavellian point there, that Coriolanus can't adapt to the switch from war to peace. So this, we learn that Aufidius is not as open and in that sense noble in his nature as Coriolanus. He's very much willing to scheme and in fact use Coriolanus. That scene, someone just said that Aufidius is wrong to accept Coriolanus in that scene. I often wonder if he hasn't thought it all the way through and realized he's in a win-win situation, that if he goes with Coriolanus at this point, they may conquer Rome. If they don't, he will get to destroy Coriolanus. Coriolanus has a long speech in Act 4, Scene 6, or is it Act 4, Scene 5, and it would be time for Aufidius to think it through. I often would like, I would like to stage that scene with Coriolanus with his back to Aufidius and have Aufidius pull his sword and be gesturing to kill him and then hold back and be obviously thinking. And then when Coriolanus turns around, he's ready to embrace him. Because I think he thinks through this whole sequence. It's very typical in Shakespeare to have this sort of pairing between a very noble warrior like Coriolanus and a more Machiavellian schemer like Aufidius here. So why does Coriolanus give up? He's marching on Rome. Nobody can talk him out of it, not his old war mate Cominius, not his father figure Menenius. What stops him?
Mother.
Yeah, the obvious answer is mother, but what's the logic of that scene? Yeah.
Well, throughout the play, Coriolanus shows like he holds like order and kind of like what is honorable and what is noble. That's kind of what he finds most like glorious. I guess that's what
Yeah.
he dedicates his life to. And so like his battlefield and like he refuses to kind of speak with the plebeians below him. And so when his mother goes down on her knees in front of him, he like even says that it doesn't make any sense, that it's just like, so it's not in keeping with tradition, it's not honorable, it's not noble. And I think that's sort of
Actually, it says it's unnatural. which
yeah,
is really-
unnatural.
yeah.
And that's, I thought that was, I don't know, I found that to be the most powerful kind of image of the speech, the idea that, I mean, he's in this kind of great fantasy where he's scheming his revenge on Rome, and then when his mother, like, goes down to her knees in front of him, it just kind of seems to wake him up, as if he realizes that, like, because it's not an honorable thing to do, I guess. I don't know.
Well, to add on to that, she also, going back to our discussion of immortality, she makes the point on page 136. The man was noble, the man being Coriolanus, but with his last attempt he wiped it out, destroyed his country, and his name remains to the ensuing age abhorred. So she's saying if you go through with this, if you destroy your own city, then you will be immortal, but you will be a villain forever. And so I think that's another powerful.
Yeah, that's very important. And,
Or it could be that the medium that he's immortal is that people in Rome speak about him. If he wipes out Rome, then the only people that would talk about him, I mean, maybe the people in the Volscians
Well, yeah.
talk about him, but in some sense, the line, like the Roman history books won't ever exist because he wipes them out.
No, I think that's you're both making an excellent point that we've seen that there is no form of immortality other than the memory of the city. How can you then wipe out the city? It's wiping out the basis of your fame. Again, so much of the play points to the problematic nature of Coriolanus' self-sufficiency. Again, this scene begins with the most powerful statement of the desire to stand as if a man were author of himself and knew no other kin. And yet everything in the scene points to the fact that he isn't the author of himself and that he's part of a family and part of a city. Volumnia is very clever to bring that out there. You know, the name Coriolanus does not have much future among the Volsces. Remember, he got that name for destroying Corioli. And this is not going to make him popular among the Volsces. Indeed, it's something that Aufidius is able to use against him when he's that the fact that he uses that name among the Volsces. This is the bottom of page 145. I, Marcius, Caius Marcius, dost thou think I'll grace thee with that robbery, thy stolen name, Coriolanus in Coriolis, or Coriolis? You see the problem there. What's his future among the Volsces with the name Coriolanus? You can't, I'm trying to think of some English equivalent of this. Jack the Giant Slayer running for office among giants. It doesn't compute. And if your name is going to be Coriolanus, you need Rome. As other people have pointed out, what's his name going to be now? Romanus? Is that what is going to be the result of this? You really see how the inner contradictions of his whole existence come to a head here. What about the presence of his family? What does that do to him? Besides his mother, who's there. Yeah.
Besides the mother, there's also Virgilia and his son. And we've seen that the relationship between him and Virgilia is somewhat lukewarm. But I think that the son, though he doesn't say, I think he has like one line, it's just the idea of like tradition and generation. And also Shakespeare in his sonnets talks about immortality through poetry, but also through procreation. So the idea that Coriolanus lives on not just in his stories, but also in his progeny.
Yeah.
And if he were to destroy Rome, he's destroying all of like what genes he would pass on.
Yeah. Look at it's bottom of 135. Virgilia says, I in mind that brought you forth this boy to keep your name living to time. We should have mentioned this, that another form of immortality is through your progeny, through your family. And again, very strong in Rome. Again, families are very strong in our culture and in most cultures, but particularly strong in ancient Rome. There were actually family gods. Again, we always think in terms of Jupiter and Juno and these famous Olympian figures, but every Roman household had little statues to their family gods, and they prayed to their ancestors. There's a very strong sense of continuity in Rome with a family, and indeed there's a sense here in which we see the family as a force independent of the Roman polis. Indeed, it's very lucky for Rome that when the city fails here, the family steps in. That Coriolanus, when he's broken with the city, has a remaining attachment to his family. And that's where Cominius and Menenius failed. They are not family to him, even though Menenius claims to have been like a father to him. But here, it's that real family. His son, that's my brave boy, he says to him. Then well, the only thing the boy says, I'll run away till I'm bigger, but then I'll fight. And that's, chip off the old block. There's my boy. Can I kill him? I mean, in some ways, what he's being forced to confront here is the fact that he must kill the very source of his being. And Volumnia forces him to understand that. That's why the city really celebrates their return. The women who save the city when all else fails, because they represent a kind of natural connection. And the city tries to absorb all of nature into its orbit and to act as if it's everything to people, but it turns out, even in the absence of the city, the family is there and exerts a pull on Coriolanus. That's what Aufidius finds so contemptible. And even Coriolanus, of course, he thinks the gods are laughing at him for this. And he does know, bottom of page 137, "O mother, my mother, you have won a happy victory to Rome, but for your son, believe it or believe it, most dangerously you have with him prevailed, if not most mortal to him." He's not a fool. He understands what the consequences of this are going to be. But nevertheless, this is a truly tragic situation for him, where there's nothing he can do to escape guilt on either side here. If he goes on and kills Rome, as Volumnia points out, he will be remembered forever as a traitor. He will be treated as a villain in Rome. He will have wiped out his own family. On the other hand, he does understand that this will mean his death if he doesn't pursue his Volscian plan. Yes?
Incidentally, too, we've seen that Volumnia is an extremely ambitious character, and she's been wanting to gain glory for herself through Coriolanus' wounds in battle. And the way that she ultimately ends up making a name for herself is by destroying her son.
Yeah. There's a very interesting book by a man named Philip Slater, Slater, called The Glory of Hera. I'll just say, our standard view of the ancient world is it was patriarchal and women had a subordinate position, and there's a great deal of truth to that. And obviously, we've looked at this Rome regime. It is a place for the plebeians, but it has no political offices for women. And yet, what we see here is some very powerful women, and we'll follow this pattern through Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra. And Slater argues that the ancient family, though patriarchal in name, was in fact dominated by the mother because of the absence of the father in war and politics. That in the typical situation among the ancient Greeks and Romans, the father was a relatively distant figure because, again, he was often off at war. And again, this would be among the patrician families or involved in the politics of the city. And the mothers raised their children. Women were frustrated. They didn't have outlets for their own ambition or their own sense of honor, and they lived vicariously through their sons. And he shows how much of ancient mythology deals with that. Thetis and Achilles is a perfect example of it. But again and again, the situation in Greek mythology of an almost overprotective mother raising the son to be a hero, and the son having to struggle with that fixation on the mother. Coriolanus dramatizes that very well. Again, Philip Slater, it's called The Glory of Hera. Central idea is that Greek and Roman women of the patrician class fulfilled themselves through the glory of their sons. And, I raised my son to be a warrior. And it's so strong in Volumnia. Volumnia is so Roman, yet as a woman is, she's not going to go off to battle. But she does live vicariously through her son and proves to have the ultimate power over him in this final scene. And again, it's just, we have this notion, which is in many ways true, that women had a subordinate position in the ancient Greek and Roman communities. Yet, as Slater points out, Greek and Roman mythology are filled with images of powerful women, both on the level of divinity, but also in, say, a story like Antigone, for example. And so to say simply that women had no role in these societies and they were weak, and yes, they were subordinated, but they had ways of striking back. And Slater, who is a sociologist, looks to the role of the woman in the family, and Coriolanus has much of that dynamic. So Coriolanus fails. The city escapes, Rome escapes by the skin of its teeth here. It is almost destroyed. Now, we talked about this a bit already, and one of you wrote on this question, but what does Rome learn from this? That is, if you just step back from if Coriolanus was all we knew about Rome, and you made a prediction, how is this city going to turn out? You would be inclined to say this city does not have much of a future. This is a dysfunctional city. The plebeians and the patricians are at each other's odds. It's a crazy regime. Who really rules? They nominate a consul. The plebeians throw him out. They almost got destroyed by their old enemies, the Volscis. What kind of future does this city have? Well, it had a 450-year future in which it conquered the world. And I don't think you could predict that if you were living in 493 BC and look at what happened. But maybe you could if you look at the lessons that this story taught the Romans. And what might those be? The sign that they learned from them is, in fact, the future history of the Roman Republic. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the really important questions that this play ends up bringing up is, what do you do with great men?
Yeah.
Men who are Roman in the sense that we think of it. In some way, they're truly noble and better than the rest of the people. Do you give them power to do something with that greatness, or do you put measures in place that checks that ambition and that raw power? And I think ultimately Rome does end up deciding to put some checks in place.
Yeah.
Aristotle talks about this. He talks about people who are preeminent in society. People who, to give them laws would be ridiculous because they are above the law. And he says that you can either exile them, kill them, and if they're preeminent in virtue, even in the best regime, you can just let them rule you.
Yeah.
And I think since they obviously didn't let Coriolanus rule them, they've chosen the exile path.
Yeah. Banishment's a fascinating institution. We don't have it in our country. in fact, modern countries don't have it. The ancient countries had what an amazing institution where you could you didn't have to have a reason really. Put some guy up for banishment, and if the people voted for banishment, he was gone. And often it was because he's too good. Aristides the Just, you banished one of your great, this is your thing, the ingratitude of republics. It's an amazing institution. I don't know if we have anybody good enough to be banished in this country today, but it's an interesting consideration. But anyway, what did the plebeians learn from this story? Yeah.
No, I was gonna say something patricians
Oh,
learned.
okay.
Patricians learned to use war in a different way. Meaning, up to this point, as we see with the Volsces, that they used war as a threat to keep the plebeians alive. But after this, they used war to continue to push out, keep the plebeians almost too busy to worry about their own means. In other words, they don't let other threats stay on their borders. They push out. They don't let continue to be on the offensive until they go.
That's a good military point. Yeah.
In some ways, it seems that for certain generals, war is a certain kind of banishment. I'm picturing, legions, on the other side of Europe, far away from the internal politics of Rome, and in certain ways that removes them from.
That's hundreds of years later, and we'll talk about that as we get to Julius Caesar. And indeed, you're right that very often in the late days of the Republic, people jockeying for power in Rome would manage to get their rivals sent to Romania, let's say, get them as far away from Rome as possible. And again, in some ways it's obvious, but what do the plebeians learn? Yeah.
Well, that the great men are necessary at times, that there is a use for them. There's a certain annoyances that come along, particularly somebody like Coriolanus who's not very good at hiding the fact that he thinks he's better than people, but during moments of crisis, it's good to have great men.
Yeah, I mean, they know that at the beginning it's quite remarkable what some of them are willing to grant Coriolanus. They have a genuine appreciation of these great warriors. But this story deeply reinforces that. You can say that for the first time and the last time, they learn what it would be like to have one of their great men turn against them. And that, maybe you shouldn't be so eager to banish someone in the future because you may live to regret it. What else?
In some ways, it seems that it points to the direction of the institution of the dictator. That when the enemy army is at the gates, that you need the one you can't have a collection of the person's family or try to persuade. You need the one man rule. And I think at this point, this goes to what Andrew had said, that in some ways you need the great men, but at the same time you can't without them.
Yeah, that's this from Machiavelli, right? Yeah, this peculiar. The word dictator means something different to us, but this peculiar Roman institution of the dictator, which evolves later, but it's this idea that there's a crisis. The parties can't agree, and so you appoint a dictator, and for a limited period of time, and just what he says goes, and he's there to solve the crisis and to step down when the crisis is over. That's a typical example of the jerry-rigged character of the Roman regime. It's almost, again, it's not initially planned out. It's not, we would say, there's no Article 7 of the Roman Constitution that says when in trouble we appoint a dictator. That's just an institution that evolved. And it's kind of a crazy institution. You wonder how it even worked, but it did work because these dictators would actually step down from power. But it points to this need for an extraordinary executive power in time of crisis. I'm not sure you can say they have at this point, 494 BC, learned that. I think it was much later that they instituted the dictator, but there's certainly, it's revealed the problem the dictators were meant to solve. You meant something.
Oh, all I was going to do is reinforce the point that it's not only that the Roman people need a dictator to save them from external threats, but also alienating that dictator can make that person
Yeah,
threatened.
let's say great man at this
Great.
point, because it's
Okay,
not.
great man.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as if the final threat to Rome in this play was Aufidius overwhelming Rome with his Volsci armies. It was Coriolanus coming back and leading those armies against them. So they need to learn to treat the dictators in a way that they don't feel, the great men in a way that they don't feel as if it's in their self-interest to oppress the people.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess my question for the group then would be, should we be banishing these men or should we be killing them then? Because if we kill them, then we don't have to worry about them coming back and attacking us.
It's still, this is like Stalin's purges in the 30s. When Hitler invaded, there were no generals left. So killing is not a solution either. It's like, let's kill all our great men. So, I mean, I see what you're saying, but if you think that through, it's not going to be a solution either. Yes?
Yeah, it might be worth looking at Camillus and later Rome for
Yeah.
this exact question.
Yeah.
If they had killed Camillus, the Gauls would have most likely gotten them.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering, in talking of what did the patricians learn and the plebeians learn, if it's also worth considering what the tribunes learned.
Okay, that's what I was getting to. So go.
Sorry.
Go. What? No, go ahead. That's what.
Well, it seems as if they didn't realize that they were playing with fire in the same way that Menenius understood it from the very beginning,
Yeah.
the creation of the tribunes, and then the tribunes themselves seem to just be haughty.
Yeah.
And quickly learning the lesson. So I would think future tribunes would walk a little more softly.
Yeah, because they really get their comeuppance. They're about to be hanged when the people realize the results of their actions. Coriolanus is, that's the scene that Brecht omits, so it's probably worth our taking a quick look at it, where look at page 113, Act 4, Scene 6. This is their own little tragic moment here on a small scale. Sicinius says, "We hear not of him, neither need we fear him. His remedies are tame. The present peace and quietness of the people, which before were in wild hurry, here do make his friends blush that the world goes well, who rather had, though they themselves did suffer by it, behold dissentious numbers pestering streets than see our tradesmen sitting in their shops and going about their functions friendly." And then Sicinius says, your Coriolanus is not much missed, but with his friends, the Commonwealth, they are at the peak of their power here. The people are admiring them. They think they've succeeded. And then comes the news that Coriolanus is leading a Volscian army to destroy Rome, and they are in big trouble. And they start begging the patricians like Menenius, save us, save us. So remember, we see the creation of the tribunate in the beginning of this play, which again, as Machiavelli understands it, is the most distinctive institution of the Roman Republic and institutionalizes its democratic element. But it goes to the tribunes' heads that they've got this new power, and they want to exercise it, and they think they're so smart, and wow, we'll get Coriolanus kicked out of Rome, won't that be great? You're right that these particular tribunes learn something, the would-be tribunes learn something. They learn, we've got this power, but maybe we shouldn't use it indiscriminately. And of course, the people learn to distrust the tribunes.
Yeah, it's almost as if they learned they need to be less mob-like as the representatives of the mob.
Yeah. In other words, yes.
Well, there's also the case, though, you could say that people are clamoring to kill Coriolanus in the first place. If they had killed Coriolanus, they might have run into trouble, but they wouldn't have been Coriolanus facing them.
Yeah.
So in a certain sense, the mob is actually smarter than the option to banish Coriolanus.
There's a problem there. If they had killed Coriolanus, the patricians would have killed them. In other words, it's a dynamite situation here. Rome is falling to pieces in that third act, and there are people like Menenius calling for moderation. And I will say, in general, what all these people learn is moderation. That the patricians mustn't manifest their contempt for the plebeians as openly as Coriolanus did. The plebeians learn that they mustn't overuse their power, and specifically the tribunes learn it, and the people learn, at first their disposition is to think, oh, these are our tribunes. They are our leaders. They know what's best for us. Let's listen to them. And these two men, Brutus and Sicinius, are very manipulative and succeed in that. But coming out of this episode, the people will be disposed to think twice before doing what the tribunes ask them. In a way, everybody's learning to think twice. That's in a sense all Rome needs. Don't precipitously plunge into these political moves. Now, I can't prove this historically, but it is interesting how this Coriolanus story stands at the beginning of Republican history and does appear to have taught everybody a lesson in moderation. That if you're going to have this very complicated regime, and especially if you're going to give power to the people, they better learn to exercise it moderately. It's either Cominius or Menenius who says to the people in Act 3, temperately proceed to what you would violently address. And Machiavelli does make this point about the Roman Republic, that it had institutions to channel the violent impulses of the people. Banishment would be one of them. To have that option open. And again, what you're saying, openly to kill Coriolanus in Act 3 would be a very dangerous move. It would be physically dangerous just to try to kill him, for one thing. A lot of plebeians, at least 40 of them, would have died in the process, and his patrician friends were there and ready to draw their swords.
Doesn't that imply though, because they're claiming they want to kill him because he's broken the law,
Yeah.
and that the plebeians therefore do not actually respect the law, or the patricians do not actually respect the law. In a certain sense, that if you're going to say, oh, the plebeians are a lawless mob, the patricians there are threatening to become one.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, I'm not saying that in some ways I believe they had the legal right to execute Coriolanus at that point. Had they tried physically to kill them as a mob, many of them would have died. And all hell might have broken loose. In other words, the patricians would not have stood idly by and watched him killed, and Coriolanus would not have stood idly by. Again, they staged that very well in the Washington production, where you could see the physical fear of the plebeians of this patrician. Anyway, I mean, all of this is hypothetical. But it's worth thinking, how did such a messy regime not just survive, but prosper and go on to conquer so much of the world? But looking ahead to Julius Caesar, we see, as Severus said, the fundamental problem in Rome is what is the relation of these great men to the city. There are these remarkable patrician noble warriors. They are necessary because it's a world of constant warfare, and Rome is surrounded by hostile powers. For that matter, Rome, this is what they hold up as the human ideal. It is held that valor is the chiefest virtue. You need these people, but they're very difficult to deal with. They are proud by nature. They are courageous. They're very dangerous people. And again, in a world of swords, they're really very dangerous. a confrontation. Yet you do need them. Yet there's another danger, though, about these great men. We certainly see the people's suspicion of them and their mistaken assumption that they can do without them, and their disposition to get rid of them, banish them, kill them. But there's another danger that's lurking in the play with regard to the great men. Yeah.
He's an internal threat in that he wants to basically change the system. He wants to get rid of the tribunes, and he's not necessarily. There's nothing that really implies that he's going to be all that respectful to the Senate necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. These right.
There's a threat that he will become a dictator in our sense.
Yeah, the great men are possibly too great for the city. They're not happy with the regime that sets constraints on them, and
there is this tension between the city and the individual. So the individual, though he needs the city because he's not self-sufficient, he also is seeking his own glory, and in some sense comes at the expense of the republic.
yeah, and what?
Well, to connect both those points, this makes me think of Lincoln's Lyceum address when he talks about how the most ambitious men, the towering genius disdains the beaten path. And so to attain ultimate glory, you can't just fit into a system. You can't just be the next of however many consuls. You actually have to found new modes and orders, as Machiavelli would say. So yeah, exactly. They in the pursuit of their own greatness and their own ambition, they risk destroying the entire system. So that necessitates some sort of institutional checks on their ability to take those steps.
I was just going to cite the Lyceum address.
Wow. Okay.
I think it's
Okay, it's very, very appropriate, and one of the keys to understanding Lincoln. What's the people, we see here what happens when the people hate one of these great men. What's the alternative? And yes?
In Julius Caesar, we see that the plebes actually love Julius Caesar, and it's that patricians who don't love him, and eventually plot to overthrow him.
Yeah. So what's the danger, the alternate danger?
Well, the demagogues, as the tribunes shows, that if a tribune actually, or if a demagogue or somebody who had broad popular support actually managed to gain power either through the consulship or through alternate means, they could be far more dangerous anyways because there'd be no force to oppose them.
Yeah.
Well, to repose that, to rephrase that, the problem with the tribunes in Coriolanus is that they're plebeians, but what if there's a Coriolanus who does not have that contempt for the plebeians, and then they become a demagogue as a patrician, as a military leader, and that becomes a threat to the republic, and that's what we see in Julius Caesar.
Yeah. Go back to page 45. Brutus, the tribune's fear, speaking of Coriolanus, all tongues speak of him, and the bleared sights are spectacle to see him. Your prattling nurse into a rapture lets her baby cry while she chats him. The kitchen malkin pins her richest lockroom about her reachy neck, climbing the wall. Now this, of course, is the opening scene of Julius Caesar, remember. Self-showed flamens who press upon the popular throngs. Our veiled dames commit the war of white and damask in their nicely gilded checks and cheeks. Such a pother as if that whatsoever garter leads them was slightly clept into his posture power and gave him graceful posture. The plebeians, at the same time as they're disposed to hate these great men for their disdain, are also disposed to worship them. Because everybody loves a parade, everybody loves a war hero. This is the other danger to the Roman regime. One danger is that the plebeians will go against the great men and banish or kill them. The other danger is that they will follow them like gods and in effect turn the city over to them. And that's, of course, where we end up in Julius Caesar. But what we see in Coriolanus is this Roman Republic seems to depend on an incredibly delicate balance. The patricians, in some sense, must disdain the plebeians, because if a patrician was willing to ally himself with the plebeians, he'd be a very powerful force, as we see in the case of Julius Caesar. So they must keep a certain class prejudice. and not feel comfortable with the plebeians. On the other hand, they mustn't show that disdain as openly as Coriolanus does. And they're going to need a couple of people in the patrician party like Menenius who can deal with the patricians, the plebeians on their level. Similarly, the plebeians have to show some respect for these patricians and understand it's the patricians that protect them in war. On the other hand, they better keep some distance too from the patricians. If they flock after one patrician hero, that will subvert the regime as well. It looks incredibly delicate, and you wouldn't think it could last for very long, except for the fact that it did. And it's one of those mysteries of history that it did. But what it did depend on was a whole series of great patricians who kept checks and balances on each other. So we got a few minutes left here. Now, any remaining questions, comments?
Just to add on what you were saying about this distinction between the people and the ruler, and I'm not sure that it's even so much about whether the plebeians like the dictator or not, so much as whether the dictator has enough political savvy to disguise the fact that he's apart from them. So if you look at what Augustus did and how he was able to get power, it was by saying that he was just the first citizen and blurring this line so that they didn't even notice the empire forming.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. What Shakespeare shows about the common people is they really are disposed to honor their betters. And again, we think of Marxism and the proletariat and the modern world and democracy. We forget that aristocracy worked for all those centuries because people bought into the aristocratic ideology that some people were by birth better than others. That idea is simply incomprehensible to us. We rejected root and branch, all men are created equal. And the idea that's, look, this little baby, I mean, isn't it grotesque that it's the future king of England? We're already being told this, oh man, we're also excited because this little baby, 8 pounds, whatever, that it's the future. It's amazing that Americans even care about this stuff, and it's disgusting in a way that we should be prey to this Anglophilic aristocratic ideology. But it shows how powerful it is. Princess Di, we are, it's a frightening thought that we human beings have a need for aristocracy. For us, it's entertainment and sports. And, if Brad and Angelina walked in here, you guys would be in awe, right? If Lady Gaga walked in here, you'd be in awe. Lady Gaga, come to think of it, yes. We keep reconstituting aristocracy. These sports heroes, Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat. We all give them titles. It's like there seems to be something in us, sociobiology might have something to say about this, that we're disposed to look up not just to individual human beings, but to orders of human beings, as if, in some ways our movie stars are filling the role of aristocrats, and even Camille Paglia claims of gods in our culture. Notice they're immortal. Humphrey Bogart, Carole Lombard, these old movies, they're still alive in some sense. And anyway, so I'm saying, think back to when this was real, there were real aristocracies. And so these people, these common people actually are, in a sense, too disposed to honor these aristocrats and to be in awe of them. And so it's useful to have some tribunes to argue against them. And so Rome actually does function. Yes?
I was going to say that even in our ostensibly egalitarian society, we still lionize certain political figures. I mean, from Washington to Lincoln, even for a good portion of the country, Obama in the 2008 campaign,
Yeah.
people were just going crazy.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
became a sort of
This-
political
look
celebrity.
at the Lincoln Memorial. It's a Greek temple. It's like yeah. It's you know it's and so I just if we in a democratic country deify our leaders, imagine what people did in real aristocracies, where you were brought up to think these people were of a higher order, and all these customs that reinforce that. What was all that pageantry yesterday with sending a car from the hospital to the? I mean, it's all designed. This ain't an ordinary human being born. This is some higher order thing that you had to get a taxi cab to take and some guy comes out in a crazy suit and rings a bell, and so it's all designed to make you think that this was something other than a birth, just one other baby. But it's again, in fact. Aristocracy, the disposition to aristocracy is with us, and so what was it like in a world where people actually believed it?
Is it maybe that tension between this is just a birth? And I think there's that voice is always there in these kinds of conversations, and it's actually not. Well, it's in terms of political or. It's not a regular birth that by 2050, 2060 that this will be the monarch of. So maybe it's
they don't
that
know
tension
that Elizabeth's going to live forever, outlive all three of them.
Hopefully outlives Charles.
Yeah, but again, it's just in a certain sense you see here the danger of the disposition of the common people actually to deify these rulers, and in some ways it's admirable because I think the premise of Shakespeare is these are generally great men in the terms of Rome, and they are admirable, and the people do admire them. But there's a real danger to that, to the future of Republican institutions.
Yes. So when you were speaking about mothers earlier, and it seems to take this back to the play, it seems that we witnessed the Mother Victorious where politics failed at least 3 times at Coriolanus. Yeah. And yesterday we spoke briefly. I wasn't really clear on the answer of the position of the father for Coriolanus, where his father is. Yeah. Do we speak of Rome in some sense as his father? And
this is a really interesting illustration of Slater's point, which is that the ancient Greek and Roman world was characterized by the absent father, and that in this case the father is literally absent. Slater points out that whether the father was alive or not, the father was usually absent because of public affairs, either war or politics, and that we actually see the logic work out in this play. In the absence of the father, the mother is incredibly powerful, and here's the logic that Slater points out. The mother is now disposed to make more of a hero out of the son because that's her only outlet. The father, in a way, doesn't care about the son. He's a hero himself. But the mother can only become a hero through the son. Now, Slater's a Freudian, and so it's all about the narcissism of the child in this ancient family where the mother is living out all her vicarious fantasies through the child and, in a sense, breeds the child to think he's a god. It's again, this book's called The Glory of Hera. It's a very interesting book. I don't go along with its Freudianism, but I think it really does tell a lot about the psychological mechanism by which the ancient world turned out, and I'll use the Freudian term, one narcissistic hero after another, beginning with Achilles, who's a perfect example of this. So let's take a break here, and we're all ready to move into Julius Caesar, I can tell. Okay, so we've already touched on a lot of these points, but let's begin with the opening scene of Julius Caesar. see where things have changed in Rome, let me fill in just briefly 450 years of Roman history. It's an odd moment here in that Coriolanus takes place around 494 BC. We're at about 44 BC here in Julius Caesar. That's a lot of history. It is so hard for us to conceptualize what a chunk of history like that is. But think about the United States in the year 1350. It didn't exist even. Wait a minute, 1550, I should say, still didn't exist. That's, think back to 1550, how distant that is. And that's as distant as Julius Caesar is from Coriolanus in the historical period. Just roughly what happened was that this regime that we didn't think would last another week in Coriolanus kept on going. They conquered all the other peoples in Italy, the Volscis, the Samnites, the remaining Etruscans, and unified Italy. Then they ran across these Carthaginians who were across the Mediterranean from them in North Africa, and they're great rivals, and had a series of wars with the Carthaginians. They almost got beaten by the Carthaginians, especially by Hannibal, but in the end they prevailed. They ran up against the Greeks. They defeated all the Greeks. Nothing could stop them. And by the time we're in Julius Caesar, the Mediterranean is a Roman lake. They control the entire periphery of the Mediterranean, and they're at a point where the future of the Republic is now gravely in doubt. And Machiavelli points to one major transformation that occurred in Rome as a result of this expanding empire. And again, always remember the Republic created most of what we think of as the empire as a piece of real estate. What Machiavelli points to is the prolongation of military commands. That is, so much of this Roman regime depended upon the idea of the consuls serving 1 year. And that meant rapid turnover among the consuls. It meant that the consuls had 1 year to do something, and the main thing he could do was win some big military victory for Rome. But the problem as the empire expanded was it took a year to get to the frontier. If now the point was to win a battle in Spain, it took a year to get your army to Spain. And so the Romans, out of the necessity of empire, began to prolong the military commands. This is what Machiavelli says about it. It's in the Discourses. It's Book 3, Chapter 24, a chapter entitled, ominously, "The Prolongation of Commands Made Rome Servile." If one considers well the proceeding of the Roman Republic, one will see that two things were the core cause of the dissolution of that republic. One was the contentions that arose from the agrarian law. We'll set that aside from all. The other, the prolongation of commands. If these things had been known well from the beginning and proper remedies produced for them, a free way of life would have been longer and perhaps quieter. Although as to the prolongation of command, one does not see that any tumult ever arose in Rome. Nonetheless, one may see, in fact, how much the authority that citizens took through such decisions hurt the city. Then skipping a bit. Although started by the Senate for public utility, that thing was what in time made Rome servile. For the farther the Romans went abroad with arms, the more such extension appeared necessary to them, and the more they used it. That thing produced two inconveniences. One, that a lesser number of men were practiced in commands, and because of this they came to restrict reputation to a few. The other, that when a citizen remained commander of an army for a very long time, he would win it over to himself and make it partisan to him, for the army would in time forget the Senate and recognize that head. Because of this, Sulla and Marius could find soldiers who would follow them against the public good. Because of this, Caesar could seize the fatherland. For if the Romans had never prolonged magistracies and commands, if they would not have come so soon to so much power, if their acquisitions had been later, they would have come later still to servitude. Very key passage. I don't know if that was in your reading assignment, but you see the point here. People started having legions serving under them for 5 years instead of 1 year. That reduces the number of people in Rome who have commanded armies. Again, the genius of the consulship institution was that you always had, in effect, generals that you could fall back on, and you weren't crucially dependent on one general. But if the generals start to command for long periods of time, there are fewer and fewer people with the experience of command that you can turn to. Moreover, the armies start to become loyal to that general. They've served under him for 5 years. Under the old Roman constitution, you'd serve under a general for 1 year, and you knew a replacement was coming. And your loyalty was to Rome, not to the particular general. But what you started to get is legions who were completely linked to an individual general like Julius Caesar, and who were in effect paid by that general. Typically, these generals used their conquest to fund the armies. They would use the loot they got, let's say, from conquering Gaul to pay off the legion in Gaul. And that meant you had much less sense that you were being paid by the Roman Senate, more sense you were being paid by this individual general, and so you were loyal to him. So that's the major transformation that flowed as a consequence from the expansion of the empire. And it's this strange logic that the acquisition of an empire eventually generated an imperial regime in Rome, and that's what we look at in Julius Caesar. So, turning to the opening scene of Julius Caesar, what has changed Rome? It's really remarkable. Remember, the opening scene of Julius Caesar was undoubtedly written first, and the opening scene of Coriolanus would have been written, let's say, 8 years later, and yet it's as if Shakespeare, I would say, wrote these three plays at the same time and consciously wished to juxtapose the opening scene of Julius Caesar with that of Coriolanus, as if he'd written the opening scene of Coriolanus first. That's what you can do when you're Shakespeare. You can plan things out over 10 years and write, King Lear and Hamlet in between and still know what you're doing with your Roman plays. So, what's so different now as Julius Caesar opens? Yes?
Athenians weren't rising up against the future. They were basically, in Julius Caesar, they were cheering out for him, they were out in the streets even though they had regular jobs, and it was the tribunes that let them go back to their normal lives. Whereas in Coriolanus, you had the plebes rising up against the upper class because they were starving. So it was like a completely different dynamic. That you have the underclass worshiping this great man.
Yeah, it's our fear, just the fear we were talking about, that the plebeians have now gone over to one of these great men.
And the tributes seem to be the ones disdaining the people rather than the ultimate elite, such as Caesar.
Now, the tribunes in Coriolanus did dispose the people to hate the great man, but the people went along. Now they're really upset that they can't get the common people to get angry with Julius Caesar.
There's also a very striking difference in just how the characters are cast. We have unnamed citizens in Coriolanus. They're this sort of great mass of unclean, bad breath people. And in Julius Caesar, we have a carpenter and a cobbler. In Coriolanus, they're speaking in plurals. We want food, whereas they're being differentiated by their dress. They're speaking in first person. I do this.
Yeah.
So that it's a much greater sense of
How does
being
their dress differ?
working class.
Yeah.
So they have a certain costume or outfit according to what trade they.
Yeah. Do you notice that Morella says, this is on, what is it, page 3, their best apparel on. What dost thou with thy best apparel on? What does that imply? Yeah.
They're doing what we've done. They've dressed up because they're going to go see somebody they think is important.
Yeah.
They're
Could
on
the
their own.
plebeians and Coriolanus dress up?
No, they didn't have anything better.
Yeah, they just had that. They had the rags, whatever. It's a kind of interesting touch here, but you see that they're still plebeians, but they definitely are wealthier. They're tradesmen now, carpenter, shoemaker. It's a more prosperous city, as indeed it was. I mean, that the Rome of Coriolanus was really a Rome of poverty, where people were starving to death. The plebeians at the beginning of Coriolanus, they are in extreme need, extreme poverty. These people, they got a holiday, for one thing. They're idle creatures. They got spare time. They got the shoemaker can take a day off. He's not living from day to day, hand to mouth. This is a wealthy city now. Yes.
Also, I'm not sure how important this is, but I was struck by the fact that, first of all, the cobbler's pretty funny and he's pretty smart.
Yeah.
But he also has this kind of ongoing pun about souls.
Yeah.
And he never shows up later on, so I don't know what.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if that's important, that he is essentially judging the quality of the character of others, and maybe we can say that he doesn't do necessarily the best job, but there's a sense that he's kind of mocking the tribunes.
Yeah, I was struck by the line on page 4, line 32. Truly, sir, to wear out their shoes to get myself into more work. There is a sense here that there's now a split between the common good and the private good. That this guy is there to make the people lose the tread on their shoes so he can get more work. And of course, he's a mender of bad souls. And there's a little hint now, maybe there's bad souls in Rome compared to the Rome of Coriolanus. Now, why are the tribunes so upset with this celebration of Julius Caesar? What's different about it? Yeah.
It's like a sign of disloyalty to Pompey, because I guess Caesar killed Pompey's children. There's says that they comes in triumph over Pompey's blood.
Yeah. Well, no, Pompey's been killed in Egypt. Yeah.
Right, so there's this similar notion that we had in Coriolanus about the people being volatile and that their loyalties can change easily. So the tribunes are saying, well, now all you're doing is worshiping Caesar because he's winning. You used to favor Pompey, but now.
So we definitely see this problem that they're now, in effect, whoring after great patricians. One day it's Pompey, one day it's Caesar. It's now, in Coriolanus, they came out hating Caius Marcius. They came out in agitation against a patrician. It turns out they're fickle as well, but now the fickleness manifests themselves that the people are now buying into one patrician after another. Now, this is a Roman triumph, this institution. Caesar's got his big day. He's leading a procession. Everybody's cheering him. We saw the prototype of this when Coriolanus returned from his great victory at Coriolis, where, again, just like the populace turned out to celebrate him. But what's different about this triumph? It's what really upsets the tribunes.
What's a Roman triumphing over another Roman?
Yeah. This is civil war. This is a real turn. Coriolanus celebrates a victory over the Volsces. Julius Caesar is celebrating a victory over Pompey, a fellow Roman. And this is what upsets the tribunes. If you look at page 4, Morellus' speech there, wherefore rejoice? What conquest brings he home? What tributaries follow him to Rome to grace in captive bonds his chariot wheels? Now, Caesar has celebrated such triumphs in the past, his triumphs over the Gauls, and that's sort of okay, though he disobeyed the Senate in doing that. But this is a new kind of triumph, celebrating a victory over another Roman general. And that's really ominous. And of course, it shows how things have changed. Part of the problem is we're at that moment when Rome's conquered just about everybody, and there's nobody left to conquer except other Romans. Now, again, historically, Caesar had conquered Gaul, enormous victories, spectacular military victories. His military genius was incomparable. But the Senate had grown afraid of the fact that these legions were loyal to Caesar. They told him he could not bring those legions on Italian soil, and he crossed the Rubicon. He was told, you can't go any further than this river, and he did. And he essentially was marching on the capital of Rome with these great armies, and that's when the Senate proclaimed him an enemy of the people. And Pompey, who'd been allied with Caesar, led the Senate faction against Caesar, but Pompey allowed himself to be outmaneuvered. Caesar's armies defeated him. Pompey fled to Egypt. The rulers in Egypt killed Pompey, sent his head to Caesar, thinking Caesar would be pleased. Secretly, he probably was, but he pretended he wasn't. And I think he had the people killed who killed Pompey. But that's the situation we're in here, where Pompey, who had been allied in the first triumvirate, Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey, were ruling Rome effectively. Now Caesar defeated the armies of Pompey, which were standing up for the Republic. This is a very difficult moment for Rome. I mean, Caesar's got all the military power. And now what we see is, in some ways, the worst development, that the people are on his side. The people had been the last check against these great men. As we saw in the case of Coriolanus, as somebody became too famous for military victories, had the army on his side, there was always the hope that the people would stand up against him. Now the people are running after Julius Caesar as the great victor, just as they once celebrated Pompey. Now, why has that happened? It's not immediately clear from the opening scene, but there's a lot of evidence in this play, and some of you I saw writing about this last night, of why Caesar is such a great man in Rome now, why, among other things, he's won over the plebeians to his cause. So let's open that up for discussion. What has Caesar done that, for example, Coriolanus didn't do? Why does he have the plebeians on his side? Yes?
I know that when Antony read his will, he mentioned that a lot of money was given to the plebeians and also land open to the public. Did Julius Caesar did that before?
Well, that's interesting. Antony's will is a good illustration of Caesar's policies. It's a continuation of them, in that I don't think Caesar had distributed money to the population before this, but I'm not sure he might have. But those are good examples. So why don't you just explain why that works?
So, as in after he died and Pyrrhus made a speech, Antony also made a speech, showed his body, and then read the will. And people were very. They supported Caesar because he gave them money after he died. But that's just a part of the story. I don't really know the whole background of that.
Yeah, I don't know the full details of that either, but in any case, we can see Antony as the continuation of Caesar's policy, and one of those policies was to buy off the people, yes.
Well, another reason that people seem to love him, I think it's good to draw attention to Antony's speech, is that he didn't seem ambitious to the people. And I think ambition is big. Like Coriolanus is obviously very ambitious, very great-souled man, but Antony several times, says something that Caesar did and asks, "Is this ambitious?" Rhetorically, and that's the people seem to love him for not being overtly ambitious.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the other idea of buying off people.
Yeah.
And then Antony's speech that Kara is referring to, he talks about Caesar winning, victories and then bringing some of the loot to the coffers of the city.
Yeah.
And these are like well-fed people, and the city is thriving.
Yeah.
Just to buy people off.
Yeah. So in fact, in an answer to Marullus says what conquest brings thee home, Antony in effect says up to now he's brought a lot of conquests home, and indeed at this point, the city of Rome was living off the fat of the empire. And for example, I don't know about distribution of money, but grain was distributed. That is, these rulers that would bring back grain from Gaul, or particularly from Egypt, or Sicily originally, and the citizens of Rome were on the dole. It was what we would call a welfare state. As a Roman citizen, you were entitled to a certain amount of grain each week, free, and so we can see Antony continuing that policy, that the Caesarian party will rest on its distribution of money and making available public lands to the city. Yes.
Caesar also has a very well-developed sense of his public image.
Yes, that's true.
Sometimes to a detriment in that in his private proceedings with his wife, for example, he refers to himself in the third person.
Yes.
But at least in the opening act,
doesn't it creep you out when anybody today refers themselves in the third person? You know you're in trouble when anyone, and Shakespeare has a really good sense of that. Yeah.
And in the opening act where he denies the crown 3 times that Antony offers, I mean, it sounds just wonderfully staged, a sign of humility false humility.
Yeah. I mean, Caesar's at the moment here where he is de facto the one-man ruler of Rome. I think he'd already been appointed dictator for life by the Senate. What's the last step that he both wants and can't do? Yeah.
Kingship.
Yeah. And why can't he do that?
Because we talked about how the Roman people just hate king.
Yeah, they just don't like that title. It's kind of funny but it's like Caesar is all but king, and that scene with Antony offering him the crown, as Casca reports it. You really see the drama that Caesar wants to be king, but knows that would be a fatal step. And so we've got this perfectly stage-managed photo opt spin moment where Caesar will show to the people he doesn't want to be king. We later learn that the arrangement's going to be he can wear a crown outside Italy, but not in Italy. I mean, this is the way politicians operate. I mean, to this day. And notice how Casca characterizes the whole moment. The language is, it's on page 15. This is about line 257. If the Tagrag people did not clap him and hiss him according as he pleased and displeased them, as they used to do the players in the theater, I am no true man. What does that tell us about Caesar? This language.
He's an actor.
Yeah, there's something even theatrical about him. How does that contrast with Coriolanus?
Coriolanus refused to be an actor.
Yeah, Coriolanus has contempt for actors, like a dull actor. I've forgot my part. Yeah.
I was just going to say the same thing. He doesn't know how to be anything apart from who he is. Like,
Yeah.
he can't fake, he tries to fake being.
Yeah. There's a great line, sincerity is the most important thing in show business. If you can fake that, you can fake anything. I feel it applies to teaching as well, but I don't want you even to contemplate that. But yeah, we finally have a patrician who's an actor and who stage manages things. And this is what the plebeians like. They like shows. I mean, we're one step from bread and circuses, you know, that famous formula of Roman imperial policy, that the emperors maintain their power by making sure the people were well fed and knowing that their food came from the emperor, and circuses, which meant horse races in Latin, by the way, but in general, popular entertainment. And we see here something amazingly theatrical about Caesar. It's really interesting, the contempt for theater in Coriolanus. Now, Rome would not have had a theater at the time of Coriolanus. By the time of Julius Caesar, Rome did have a theater. It's one of those things that a city develops over time when it becomes decadent. And so think about this. At many points in Shakespeare, he has characters express contempt for acting. It's a very curious fact. Yes?
And one of the things Caesar points out that he doesn't like about Cassius is that Cassius doesn't like plays.
It's a very good point. We're now we're on the verge of an imperial regime where you're going to want to have people who like plays, who will take pleasure in something other than politics. Who does like plays? Yeah, Antony is the kind of follower an imperial ruler wants. Cassius is not. Yes?
I think the other thing that he doesn't like about Cassius, which is interesting, is that Cassius is lean.
Yeah.
He doesn't like anybody who looks, he talks about it as a lean look in his face.
Lean, hungry look.
But there's an idea that the physical presence of the person indicates whether or not they're a threat as well.
Yeah, we might as well look at that speech because it's a very interesting one. You almost see the articulation of the new imperial policy here, which the Republic emphasized spiritedness, aggressiveness, ambition, everything that made for a great warrior, and tended to denigrate the erotic side of life, to clamp down on it. Wine is called for, I think, twice in Coriolanus. It's never served in Rome. People don't eat. Volumnius says, "Anger's my meat, I feed upon myself." But here we have Caesar saying, "Let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed men and such asleep o' nights. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much, such men are dangerous." Antony defends him. "We were fatter, but I fear him not." Skipping down, "He loves no plays, as thou dost, Antony. He hears no music." seldom he smiles, and smiled in such a sort as if he mocked himself and scorned his spirit that he could move to smile at anything. Julius Caesar already divines here what the imperial regime will look like in Antony and Cleopatra. That it'll be a world of shows, plays, spectacles, erotic things, indulgence, fat people, very much in contrast to the austerity of Republican Rome. The austerity of Republican Rome frightens Caesar because it's involved with people who are ambitious and who will challenge him for rule. He wants a world where people have given up on politics and which they're perfectly happy with plays and banquets and everything we see in Antony and Cleopatra. Really begin to see the transformation of Rome here. We're not yet out of the Republic, but we are definitely in its waning days. And one of the things is this new theatricality, which Antony is a master of. I mean, as we'll talk probably next time about his speech in detail, but certainly one of the things we see is how theatrical Antony is, and Brutus underestimates the importance of theatricality. I was starting to say it's really interesting how many Shakespearean characters express contempt for acting. Remember, Shakespeare was an actor. Again, he was an active member of a theater troupe. He was their best playwright. He was not their star actor. A man named Richard Burbage was, but he, there's a legend that he played the part of Adam, the old servant, in As You Like It, and there's some legend that he played Hamlet's ghost, Hamlet's father's ghost. That's very late stuff. That's 50 years later. Someone claimed that, but there's some evidence of what roles he played. And everybody that speaks about him among his contemporaries talks about his gentleness, which suggests he didn't have the big booming voice you needed to be a star, but he did get up on that stage, and I imagine some people are hams and love being on stage, but I imagine that this was a sensitive man, and it was difficult to get up in front of that Elizabethan audience with its legendary propensity to throw things at the actors and its unspeakably bad breath. Again, there's enough emphasis in that Shakespeare to try to imagine what it was like. Remember, there's no dentistry, there's no mouthwash, and the English are legendary for their bad teeth. They probably got braces on the royal infant already, I'm guessing. It's really interesting that Shakespeare seems to think it's contemptible to get up in front of people and stage yourself, and it may well have been from his own experience. We were and yet there's Coriolanus would say there's something shameful about Julius Caesar's behavior. He's giving the people what they want. Remember, Antony shows Caesar's wounds. Coriolanus would not show his wounds. And what Antony does is far more shameful. It's burying a dead body. I mean, that's shameful by our standards. That's a really disgusting thing to have done. But what's the positive side of this aspect of Caesar and his lieutenant Antony? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add before that, in comparing him to Coriolanus, that Caesar allows himself to be flattered. I mean, there's this really hilarious part that Colleen pointed out in her paper where he says, but when I tell him he hates flatterers, he says he does being then most flattered. Like he allows himself to be flattered by people that Coriolanus would never allow himself to.
There's a certain vanity to Caesar we'll have to talk about, but yeah.
Well, to answer your question, is we get the appearance of love and affection that is missing in Coriolanus. Like we start to see it with between Caesar and Antony, and then I think like the climax of it is with Antony and Cleopatra.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting. that just how Coriolanus doesn't really fit in the Republic. I think the point that is relevant here is that when Brutus and Cassius, after they kind of make up after their fight, when they rebuke the poet, and they pretty much call him foolish, they show that they don't really fit into the imperial kind of regime either, because they just have no room for poetry, no room for all that
It's
stuff.
interesting. We've just heard Cassius doesn't like plays.
Yeah.
Yes.
And arguably, at the end when Antony, I feel like Antony talks about Brutus being the only honorable one in the group, and he sort of doesn't fit either in the conspiracy or in the empire because he's still interested in the common good, and that's going to be opposed to an empire.
Yeah. I'm getting, there's a certain intellectual quality to Caesar that's lacking Coriolanus. Yes, he lacks shame, but one reason he does is he's not as bound by the conventions of Rome. Caesar thinks out of the box in a way that Coriolanus doesn't. And we've seen, in some ways, Coriolanus stays a Roman even after he leaves Rome. He can only think in Roman terms. The daring of Julius Caesar is, to do things that no patrician has ever done before. Leading an army against another Roman, for example, challenging the Senate, crossing that Rubicon. It's an incredible moment when, he's told by the Senate, you cannot bring your army onto Italian soil, and threatened with the idea that the Senate would order the army to desert Caesar. Took incredible courage, what Caesar did, and a kind of intellectual courage to say, well, I can do what no Roman has ever done before, and I will be rewarded for it. All these patricians have been intensely competitive. They've all been striving to be the greatest man in Rome, in a sense to excel all the other patricians. But Julius Caesar has carried the game to another level now. He has reached the point where he has no rival. He created this triumvirate with Pompey, who was a great military leader, and Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome. One thing that, Coriolanus had scorn for riches. He didn't even want an extra share from the army. But Caesar has learned the political power well. One thing he did was to buy offices. I forget if he got Antony made tribune or something like that, but he bribed people to get offices for his supporters, and of course he was using his money to pay his legions. It's unimaginable how wealthy these Romans, the great Romans, were at this point. They would conquer a province and they'd have all the income from their province essentially for their private use. It's a foretaste of what the emperors were to be like. But Caesar has essentially outmaneuvered all the other patricians. He's been more daring in military terms, and now he's crossed the line. He's got the plebeians on his side, the ultimate weapon of a patrician against the other patricians. The patricians had counted on the plebeians checking the excessive power of any one patrician, as we saw in the case of Coriolanus. But now we've got a Julius Caesar who's willing to, give grain to Coriolanus. Objected to the giving out of grain to the people. Julius Caesar has participated in the policy of giving them money, giving them land, and now there's no one to rival him in Rome. And that really annoys people like Cassius. What's Cassius's reaction to what's happened? Yeah.
There's an implication that you should have just let him drown.
Yes.
That he really regrets saving him in the river, and that he thinks that he doesn't like the fact that now he's going to have to bow to this person that he thinks of as being sort of weak, and somebody who's deaf in one ear and isn't really that great. He knows that from when they were younger that he's not really that great.
Yeah, because what's happened in Rome that really grates a man like Cassius? Yeah.
There has become a god.
Yeah, taken that far.
There's also, you don't have 20 consuls at once. There's no space for somebody like Cassius to rise to some level as Caesar. There's only one Caesar.
Yeah, and now remember, we're not talking democracy here. What Cassius is referring to is the equality of aristocrats. In other words, this isn't a common man saying he's no better than I am. This is a patrician saying he's just another patrician. So, I mean, it's short of modern democracy, but it's very real in Roman terms.
Yeah, on page 11, Cassius says, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and people doubt to find ourselves dishonorable graves."
Yeah. It's an unprecedented moment, continuing on that page, line 150, "Age, thou art shame. Rome, thou hast lost the breed of noble bloods. When went there by an age since the great flood, but it was famed with more than with one man? When could they say till now that talked of Rome, that her wide walks encompass but one man? Now is it Rome indeed, and room enough when there is in it but one only man. Oh, you and I have heard our fathers say there was a Brutus once that would have brooked the eternal devil to keep his state in Rome as easily as a king." And this refers back to the original Brutus who led the rebellion against the Tarquin kings in the generation right before the story of Coriolanus. So this is the culmination of this Roman patrician frustration. What has the Republic been about except that we patricians are equal? Again, I want to stress it's not democratic, all men are equal. But it is the idea that no patrician has a status above another patrician. That's what it means to have an aristocratic republic and not a kingship. And now we're in a situation where Caesar is ruling de facto in Rome. Again, I believe had been elected. I love that term, dictator for life, the kind of thing they only do in North Korea now. It really is a transformation of Rome. And the question is, where does Caesar go from now? Again, he does appear not to know what to do next. The whole thing in front of the people with the crown may have been a trial balloon. What if they had applauded and shouted, "Take the crown"? Maybe he would have. Again, he's testing the waters here. He's trying to find an arrangement somehow to legitimate this extra constitutional position he has. Now, we've touched on this, but let's see a little more of how Shakespeare portrays this man, Julius Caesar. Play is named after him. Famously, he doesn't survive the third act. A lot of question, is he a great man or is he not a great man? What are the weaknesses that Shakespeare shows in him? Yeah.
Well, I think first he's impulsive. He doesn't know his own limitations. So to go back to the leaping into the river, it's his instigation that causes all of this. He says, "Do you dare, Cassius, to leap with me into there?" And then the problem is that then somebody else has to bail him out. And this is a perfect illustration of the concerns that some kind of monarchy would bring up, that he wouldn't know his own limitations and other people would pay for it.
Yeah. Yes.
In their first conversation, Brutus and Cassius talk about how you can't clearly see yourself and you need others to act as mirrors because the eye can't behold itself. And I think one of Caesar's biggest problems is that he's somewhat deluded about who he is. We hear him say that he compares himself to the North Star, and he thinks he's very indifferent to things. He thinks he's above vanity and above all these mortal sins. But as a lot of people in the play point actually just as much of a patrician as everyone else. And so when he kind of thinks that he has nothing to fear, he says that he's more dangerous than danger. But right after he kind of makes the statement that he'll never fall, he'll never shake, they kill him.
Yeah. I want to dwell on that for a minute, especially the passage about the eye that you referred to. Because generally speaking, one of the problems with these Romans is self-knowledge. They do, and this is true of Coriolanus, true of Julius Caesar, we'll see it's true of Brutus and Cassius. They are noble and they have an incredible noble self-conception, but we do see a degree of self-deception goes on there. This is page 8, where Cassius says, it's about line 50, he says to Brutus, tell me, good Brutus, can you see your face? No, Cassius, for the eye sees not itself but by reflection, by some other things. 'Tis just, and it is very much lamented, Brutus, that you have no such mirrors as will turn your hidden worthiness onto your eye, that you might see your shadow. I dwell on this because this is a quotation from Plato. And it's one of, I think, only 2 quotations from Plato in Shakespeare. It's a very strange moment. This is from the Alcibiades I, I'm sure your favorite Platonic dialogue. This is Socrates speaking to the young Alcibiades. Consider in your turn, suppose that instead of speaking to a man, it said to the eye of one of us, as a piece of advice, see thyself. How should we apprehend the meaning of the admonition? Would it not be that the eye should look at something and looking at which it would see itself? Clearly, says Alcibiades. Then let us think what object there is anywhere by looking at which we can see both it and ourselves. Why, clearly Socrates mirrors and things of that sort. It's really a very strange moment that this whole conversation about self-knowledge, seeing mirrors, it's there in the Alcibiades I, and Shakespeare puts it here in Julius Caesar. I call your attention to this because it's some indication that Shakespeare had read Plato or somehow knew about it. There's another quotation from Plato, I think it's in Henry IV, Part 2 or Part 1. Again, it's just, most people would say Shakespeare knew nothing about Plato, but he seems to quote him at this point, yes.
Well, I think that he draws an interesting parallel with Alcibiades, but because Alcibiades is a charming man. He's good looking. I think he's better looking than Caesar was probably, but he's one that was able to woo, as we've already talked about, not only one city but 2, and so and he ultimately is a tyrant of some sort. So it's a good.
Yeah, it actually does have lots, because the Alcibiades I is all about Alcibiades' desire to rule the world, which Socrates uncovers in this youthful kid. It's an extraordinary dialogue in that sense, and it's about the issue of tyranny here. The incident of the river is so emblematic of Caesar. On the one hand, it shows his daring, and that was his great characteristic as a military leader. He took unbelievable chances and somehow managed to succeed. The Gaul campaign was the most extreme example of that. On the other hand, what you see is sometimes he was not aware of his physical limits. What are some of the signs of his physical limitations?
Well, he has these spontaneous seizures.
Yeah, he was in fact an epileptic. Yeah.
Deaf in one ear?
Yeah, and that passage is really Shakespeare at his best in that Caesar is saying. Where is that? That's right. Yeah. It's the bottom of page 13, where line 211. I rather tell thee what is to be feared than what I fear. For always I am Caesar. Come on my right hand, for this ear is deaf. I mean, he's at his peak of his self-confidence and projecting this image, and then we realize, well, wait a minute, this great man is deaf in one ear.
There's also a curious line later on page 19 where Casca says to Cassius, your ear is good, Cassius. And there seems to be an implication that maybe Cassius is a little bit keener.
Yeah.
Somehow physically superior.
Yeah, I have that noted here. I have contrasted Julius Caesar, right? You're absolutely right, yeah.
Also, Cassius talks about his sort of like feeble temperament and how he gets this fever in Spain, and that if you look at Caesar like sort of out of the limelight, that he actually loses all his luster and he's prone to sickness and feebleness and needs someone else to take care of him.
Yeah, but he's a human being and has a body, and that sets limitations to him.
Yeah, when I was reading this, I was trying to relate this more generally to the problem of monarchy, for example, where kings are said to have divine right, and yet, you know, royal bloodlines are racked famously with you know, hemophilia and other diseases. So it's just interesting that there's you know, we see this in Caesar, and I'm wondering whether Shakespeare had. I'm not sure about the Elizabethan bloodline at that time of the English king, but.
The king is but a man. It's a great theme in Shakespeare's history plays. And the sense, or King Lear, they told me I was everything. I was not ague-proof. There's one of the great themes in Shakespeare is that kings are also human beings and subject to the infirmities of human beings. And we see that here in Julius Caesar. That he now, but the interesting, I will say, many people point to this evidence and say that Shakespeare is denigrating Caesar. In a strange way, these details build him up, and that we see he has physical infirmities and can triumph over them. And I do believe the premise of the play is that Caesar is a great man. Because look where he is. An ordinary man couldn't get to this point where all these noble Romans have in fact given in to him and are now worried about their civility. Nevertheless, he's still, you know, there's some ways in which he has come closer to godhood than any other human being, and indeed he will become divine after his death. But still we're reminded that he is ultimately still a human being with human infirmities. And what Cassius wants to say is, I don't care how great he isn't of a different order. You know, he's still a patrician, just as I am. So it's a very complex portrayal. He is a great man, but for example, he's now subject to flattery. What is this business of for always Caesar is not afraid? What's he doing there? Yeah.
Part of it is like people brought up the idea of him as an actor, he's crafting his own myth.
Yeah.
And I think part of the issue is that he bought into it, but he's very interested in how the Senate sees him, how the plebeians see him, and how all of his actions will be seen by others.
So it is, you know, again, it's curious. In some ways, he acts indifferent to his public image, but he's always obsessed with it. But he's creating a new title, Caesar. What are the descendants of that title in our world? Tsar and Kaiser. It's kind of amazing to think about it, that people go around calling themselves the Caesar. And look at his problem is the title of king is unavailable. His answer was to turn his own name into a higher title than king, because Kaiser and Tsar mean emperor. And they're higher titles. It's a big deal when the Prince of Muscovy decided to call himself the Tsar of Muscovy. And the same thing when they were unifying Germany and decided to have a Kaiser.
Well, interestingly, even the Ottoman Sultan claimed the
Yes.
title of Caesar. I don't know the Turkish in it, but
Yeah.
it translates to Caesar of New Rome.
Yeah, it's amazing that this guy turned his name into the highest title you could have, a title that dwarfed king. Yeah, so.
I think that's, from what I remember, he's talking to Decius in that section, and it's weird because I think it brings back Colleen's point where reflection is a big weakness for Caesar, and that Decius is basically able to set the trap for Caesar by telling him you are what you would like to think you are.
Yeah.
Because the dream his wife has is basically like the biggest flashing warning sign you could possibly get. It's very obvious, and yet he basically it's very easy for Decius to just say, oh no, your reflection is like this, and just show him a false image and essentially make him
Yeah.
go along.
He's a man, Caesar's a man who manipulates images, but people are able to turn that against him.
Here's the thing, though. I think yes, the beware the Ides of March, and then you have the wife's dream. These are the two big warnings that Caesar rashly ignores to his own peril. But I don't know. Maybe I'm being anachronistic here. But if I were about to be crowned dictator for life, and I'd fought for this, built it up for years and years and years, some lunatic comes up to me on the street and says, "Beware the Ides of March." I'm not going to listen to it. Same as I'm not going to let my wife's dreams dictate my behavior. So I don't know. It just
Watch out for this guy.
Yeah.
He clearly wants to rule the world. Yeah.
I think when he initially, when Calpurnia gives him that dream, he decides to stay home. But when his men come up to him and it's like, oh, you're going to stay home because your wife had a dream, and it's putting pressure on Caesar doesn't fear anything. So in order to keep that image, he has to go. And you see that, like, they were like, oh, you cannot go, and he's like, I will not go. And he's very concerned with seeming like he can do anything.
But Colleen, it wasn't because his wife had a dream, because his wife knelt down and begged him to
he
stay.
was kind of appeasing her. Yeah.
So he wasn't afraid of the wife's dream, like he wasn't afraid of the other soothsayer that was more famous, like Arden and Norris.
Yeah. But what he's afraid of is people thinking he is giving in to his wife. And of course, now, again, this is something that's changed in this play. Virgilia couldn't get away with asking Coriolanus to stay at home. If she had, I mean, it's just unimaginable that she would say, don't go to this battle, you might get wounded. But we're now in a world where women have a little more role in the city.
And this begs the question of, is then Caesar self-sufficient if he can be manipulated through his public image?
Yeah, I mean, again, his claim is, I am constant as a northern star. That's a claim to self-sufficiency. I cannot be moved. And yet, we know he can be moved by various people. It's one of the tragic irony of his situation is he becomes captive of his own public image. He is so concerned with projecting the image of a god and being above fear that he can't even be prudent in these situations. And again, he goes to his death to live out the legend he's created. Now, of course, that works in a weird way. He then becomes a god after his death, and Caesar becomes a new title. Now let's go back to Cassius and Brutus and Casca and look at this conspiracy that forms against Caesar. Who are these guys and why do they object to Caesar? Yeah.
Well, I actually had a question
Oh,
about
sure.
about this, what you just said,
Yeah.
in the speech that Brutus gives on page 26, where he's talking about the ladder.
Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering to what extent when he says that he's concerned that Caesar is going to turn his back on the ladder, like turn his back on all the rungs. I mean, is he referring to turning his back on the common people, or is he more concerned with him turning his back on the other patricians? Because it seems like amongst the different conspirators, like Brutus is very concerned about the common people and the public good, but for some of the other conspirators, most notably Cassius seems to feel slighted that Caesar's elevating himself over the other patricians. So, I mean, their motivations are all quite different in a certain sense.
Yes, I think you're right that in the case of Cassius, it's largely patrician resentment and one patrician parading himself as superior to the others. Brutus, that's an element in Brutus, and we'll see that when we look at the carrying out of the conspiracy. But in Brutus, there is more of this sense of a public good involved. And so I think he's concerned for all of Rome, and that would include the plebeians, but don't underestimate the degree to which he's concerned about patricians above all. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is, so not to bring up Lycian's Lyceum address again, but I mean, there's a keen sense in that there he develops that the ambitious man requires a certain reverence. So once you grant that power to the great man, then once he has it, then he prefers to beat out his own path. So what keeps him from stopping? From turning his back on the aristocracy, or turning on the people.
Yeah, it is interesting that Brutus still is debating it, because and notice he says, bottom of 25, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. That would confirm your point. And indeed, Brutus had been a member of the Pompey's party, and Caesar was very generous to the Pompey party. Those who survived, he did not kill, and in fact rewarded them with, in the case of Brutus, with some office, and showed something of Caesar's magnanimity. How about Casca? What does he represent in the conspiracy? It's tough because he doesn't articulate it much. How would you compare him to Cassius and Brutus? Yeah.
He seems to be somewhere in between. I mean, in his discussion with Cassius, you see that Cassius can kind of rile him up by saying, why should Caesar be so above us if we're his equal? But also on page 21, he mentions that the senators tomorrow mean to establish Caesar a king, and he will wear his crown by sea and land in every place, save here in Italy. And so he also seems to fear like the tyranny that is more Brutus's, I guess, problem with Caesar. So.
Yeah. I mean, he's kind of the average patrician. It's sort of a contradiction, but he doesn't seem as noble as Brutus and Cassius. But it shows you that this is the kind of typical patrician who can't, without prodding, might have accepted what's happened, but with some prodding, with more intelligent and more concerned patricians, he's not happy with this situation and will do something about it. Yeah.
There's a line on 16 where Brutus and Cassius are speaking about Casca, and Brutus says, "What a blunt fellow is this grown to be? He was quick to meddle when he went to school." Cassius replies, "So is he now an execution of any bold or noble enterprise? However, he puts on this tardy form. This rudeness is a sauce to his good wit, which gives men's stomach to digest his words with better appetite." And I think there's a way in which Casca represents the fall of the Roman patrician, in that he used to be somebody, he could have been somebody like Coriolanus, and now he's kind of dull and boring, but if you really rouse him with a noble idea, he can still return to the former spiritedness of the patrician.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Yes.
And like Coriolanus on page 14 and 15 shows us in this scene and opens, like they're sweating nightcaps and sneaking crabs. He mentions they're sneaking crabs several times, and then he says these are ragtag people.
Yeah, the difference between nobles and commoners was much more striking in this ancient world or in Shakespeare's day than any differences in the world today, thanks to the availability of CVS and its marvelous deodorant products and such things. Can't imagine what the smell of prior worlds must have been like. Now, this conspiracy forms, and the great question is, why does it fail? maybe it was doomed to failure from the beginning. But still, I think Shakespeare goes out of his way. So it's a potentially solid conspiracy because of its breadth. Notice that Cassius understands that. Why, for example, does Cassius need Brutus in this conspiracy? Yeah.
He has some credibility to the cause. He realizes that he's not one of the better liked men.
Cassius is not.
Cassius is not. But Brutus has a reputation for being very honorable, a very good man. So he thinks that if he gets himself to that side, he can kind of foil Antony, who also has that reputation.
Yeah. What else?
Also with Brutus, he's closer to Caesar, so that even if one of Caesar's like companions is turning against him, then it shows some credibility to the Republic.
Yeah, it's respectability, it's credibility, it's the idea Cassius might be doing this for personal reasons and personal grievances. Caesar had not honored Cassius, but he had honored Brutus. So you could not accuse Brutus of doing this for personal reasons, as he himself understands. Yeah.
Well, Brutus was also descended from kingslayers. So
yes,
I think
that's
came from but seriously, he actually, his ancestors did slay the Tarquin.
It's a very important thing. I mean, again, we have some sense of our ancestors, but the Romans had a much stronger sense. The fact that he still would be called Brutus after 500 years. That would not happen. It does not usually happen in the modern world. But the Romans were very careful of descent, and there's this very strong sense that he is the descendant of the Brutus who expelled the Tarquin kings. So, I mean, one thing that you can say for Cassius is he understands the need to put together a good conspiracy, but why then does it fail? Yeah.
They don't rip out the Caesarian party like root and stem, which really would involve killing Antony.
Yeah,
that was the mistake.
Their major mistake is not killing Antony, but they make some mistakes before then that are telling as they're putting together the plan. What's their first decision?
Is it not to include Cicero? Or
Actually, their first decision is whether to have an oath or not. And that itself is kind of telling. But let's go to the Cicero decision. This is the bottom of page 30. But what of Cicero? Shall we sound him? I think he will stand very strong. Let us not leave him out. No, by no means. Let us have him, for his silver hairs will purchase a good opinion. And Brutus is the one that negates it. Oh, name him not, let us not break with him, for he will never follow anything that other men begin. Now, why is this a mistake? Leaving out Cicero. Yeah.
Well, you would have had an orator to rival Antony.
Yeah, he was the greatest orator in Rome. And looking ahead, as we now know, they do succeed in killing Caesar, but they fail because of the speech contest. And we'll talk about that, but Brutus's oratory does not measure up to Antony's, and Cicero surely would have had the best shot at giving the oration on behalf of killing Caesar. But Cicero was famous for a series of speeches against Antony after these events. There's Cicero's Philippics, in which he attacked Antony and there's some evidence that Shakespeare might have read them. Anyway, if you're having a conspiracy, surely you would want to include a very famous, I mean, just what they say, oh, let us have him for his silver hairs, will purchase us a good opinion, and by men's voices to commend our deeds, it shall be said, his judgment ruled our hands. He would lend further credibility and above all lend the oratorical ability that the conspiracy turns out to lack. And what does it tell us the reason Brutus insists on omitting him? So very few people have concentrated on this. Yes?
So well, he says he will never follow anything that other men begin. So perhaps he's saying that Cicero is too great to, he's also one of these towering geniuses like we were talking before.
Now, in fact, that wouldn't have been true and that Cicero wasn't looking to rule Rome. But what does it imply about Brutus's self-conception here? Yeah.
Brutus is willing to follow what other men begin. More than what he realizes necessarily, because he doesn't necessarily know exactly who sent him all these letters.
Yeah.
But he is not the one planning this. He is directing it to some extent, but he's not.
Oh, yeah. Well, isn't he taking over the conspiracy here? In other words, what I read this as is saying, I'm the leader of this conspiracy, not Cicero. Because after all, he's making, as we see in the sequence, he overrules Cassius at every stage of the way. He's the one that goes in to the marketplace to justify the assassination. It's as if he's saying, I don't want to share the glory with Cicero. Yes?
And it also kind of makes the conspiracy seem more than just this one act. It seems like a kind of a whole plan for societal reform, because I mean, he will never follow anything that other men begin. So, I mean, if we take the Machiavellian term, he's founding new orders, or new orders are going to be imposed.
Yeah, but I, Brutus, want to do it. And the fear is that Cicero will, if we bring in Cicero, he'll be the leader of the conspiracy. Certainly the genius of Cassius has been to bring in Brutus to do what Cassius wants to do, but to give Brutus the sense that he's now the leader. And Cassius defers to Brutus on every point in this sequence, with Cassius knowing that he's right and Brutus is wrong, because he feels he needs Brutus and needs to give him the impression that he's in charge here. Because, Cassius says, then leave him out. It'd be up to an actor to determine it, but there could be a great deal of frustration in Cassius' voice there. Man, do we ever need Cicero? But I can't buck Brutus on this now. We got to do what he says. And then we get to the crucial decision about whether to kill Antony. And Cassius, again, is spot on, right. They got to kill Antony. And Brutus once again overrules Cassius. And what's his reasoning? Yeah.
Well, first of all, he has an idea that he will just simply kill himself if he loves Caesar so much. But I think there's also a way of just comparing his own situation to that of Antony's, and that he accepted honors after somebody he liked killed, and so maybe Antony will just accept honors and sort of be their friend again after Caesar.
Yeah. But
He also argues that once Caesar's gone, Antony won't have any power because it's just a limb of Caesar, and what's a limb without a head? And he also, his first objection is that it'll seem too bloody. And I think he's really concerned that they want to stage this assassination so that Caesar is killed, and then they'll explain it. But if they kill Antony too, it'll seem more like a killing spree, and they don't want that.
yeah, his lines are, it's on page 31, let us be sacrificers, but not butchers, Caius. We all stand up against the spirit of Caesar, and in the spirit of men there is no blood. Oh, that we then could come by Caesar's spirit and not dismember Caesar. What would Machiavelli say to this?
Soft, small.
Yeah, it is half measures, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a half measure. You're already killing someone. You've already taken that drastic step. If you're going to do that, you better make damn sure that his lieutenants are not going to come after you once you've made that move.
Yeah, this is really wrong by Machiavellian standards.
Also, when founding or trying to acquire rule, you have to commit all the violence at once.
That's a very good point, too.
Otherwise, then the violence will become prolonged.
Yeah, and its outcome will be less certain. Notice the irony here that he wants to kill the spirit of Caesar and wishes that they didn't have to make the real man bleed. The irony is that they kill the body of Caesar but set his spirit free. Antony invokes that spirit comes back to revenge. It comes, visits Brutus on the night of the battle at Philippi. So it really turns out just the opposite here.
At the same time, talking about Machiavelli's point of view on their killing, I think also Machiavelli, I think he would appreciate how Brutus like plans out the murder in a very scenic way. I mean, it kind of recalls the idea of like the killing of, or Cesare Borgia's killing of
Remedio.
Yeah. Like on top of page 32, let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods, not hew him as a carcass fit for hounds. So it has to be like that. Machiavelli would appreciate Brutus's concern for the killing looking very beautiful and dignified.
And of course, it isn't in the event.
Yeah.
So there's this sense in which Brutus thinks this isn't an assassination; it's a sacrifice. We can spin it as something noble. In the event, it turns out to be a brutal, ugly scene, and they can't avoid that. Yeah.
I don't know. I may not necessarily agree with that interpretation. I remember with Tarkov, for example, he mentioned that the goal of the scene on Christmas Day with the knife found in the subordinate. The point of that was to illustrate that if you thought this subordinate was bad, I'm twice as bad.
Yeah, shock and awe.
Yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue of just showing the ability and will for violence. And for Brutus, it seems the concern for blood is more of a public. It's less. It's you want to seem less violent so that you can seem that your intentions are more honorable.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be a bloody event, and Brutus wants to pretend it won't be. That we can carve him as a dish fit for the gods. It turns out to be the complete opposite of that, and Antony is able to exploit the bloodiness of it, which turns it into a horrific spectacle for the common people who see it as indeed the butchering of this great man. In any case, you see the problem with this conspiracy is it attempts to be broad-based and then fractures on the broadness of the base, that Cassius thinks he can bring Brutus in to give it this sense of broad base, and yet Brutus then defeats Cassius in every detail of the right way to do it, and then, culminating in letting Antony speak second, which is the stupidest thing of all here, if you know anything about oratory.
If we can, since we're going with try to go with the Machiavellian interpretation, would this be the problem of allies then? That it's unreliable and they're not. Essentially, you're devolving the modes of acquisition to someone else. You're not relying on your own arms.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that, what is it, Book 3, Chapter 6, the long chapter on conspiracies. Machiavelli points out how difficult conspiracies are for all these reasons. The more people you bring in, the more success it's likely to have, but the more likelihood of failure because word is going to leak out. And there's a lot in this play. I mean, how does the soothsayer know about the Ides of March? More to the point, how does Artemidorus know so much about the conspiracy? And Portia, Brutus's wife, almost leaks the whole thing by sending a slave boy to the Capitol to bring back news of what? It's like telegraphing the assassination. Will you go see if they've killed Caesar yet or what they're doing? So you do see some of the problems. This conspiracy is porous. That word of it seems to leak out. So it is, it's a great question that the play leaves, I believe, open. I'm just going to conclude with this point that on the one hand, there's a lot of evidence that Rome is hopelessly doomed to one-man rule here. And we'll talk about that next time. And yet, Shakespeare does show us the individual decisions that the conspirators make, which could have gone differently and would have given a much greater probability to the success. Above all, if they had killed Antony, which means he would not have given that speech, and all the Caesarian party would have been Lepidus, who's kind of incompetent, and Octavius Caesar, who's a boy. Really is a question, if they'd killed Antony, could they have reversed this imperial trend? Could they at least have prolonged the Republic longer? And that, who knows, 100 years. I do not think that Shakespeare was a determinist. To put it bluntly, he was a dramatist, and the premise of drama is the meaningfulness of individual human action. This play is premised on Cassius's words that men at some time are masters of the fate. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. So I think Shakespeare does leave it open that this conspiracy might have succeeded by showing us the concrete acts or decisions that the conspirators took that made it a failure. And, to the last act, they could have conducted themselves differently in war. I mean, even in the last act, Brutus continues to make mistakes. Let's fight the Caesarian party now. When Cassius says, let's delay would have been the better strategy. So it's not as if there's an overwhelming sense in here that the conspiracy had to fail, because they make decisions that lead to their failure. Nevertheless, we'll look at evidence that suggests next time that maybe there was no way to stop Caesarism in Rome. So let's stop now so you guys can do whatever you have to do to get to Congress. And people do some very strange things to get to Congress, as we know.
Is that in Shakespeare?
It's interesting. Shakespeare showed very little interest in Parliament.